Well, good day my friends, it's your old pal Jordan the Lion. How are you all doing today? I hope you said great. I'm doing great. Today we're going to explore a sad time, sad day in American history, and we're going to talk about it through the eyes of the killer, John Wilkes Booth. We're going to go to the grave of John Wilkes Booth, talk about his backstory, why he felt that he needed to kill President Lincoln, and then hopefully we're going to head west, go to the Museum of Health and Medicine, where they didn't last time I was there, but they normally have the bullet on display that was taken out of Lincoln's brain after he passed during autopsy. So hopefully we'll get to understand a little bit more of the story today. Daze with Jordan the Lion and you all. It begins right now. You can tell the area where his cemetery and where he's buried is not the nicest area any longer. Well, here it is, Greenmount Cemetery. Gates are locked up, but it says you can call for entry, so hopefully we can get in there today. Alright, we are in the gates. Now let's go find the Booth family plot. This was not his original burial plot. This is a very beautiful cemetery, I'll say that. Better than he deserves, in my opinion. You also have to remember this was the very first president that had been assassinated, so this was something the country, especially having dealt with the Civil War for so long, not thinking there would ever be an end in sight, then they had to deal with the first leader of the country being assassinated as well. This is when you have to get out of your car and walk to a little bit, as you can hear the police sirens. So Booth had a pretty privileged life, actually. He was raised in Maryland. His father was considered maybe the greatest actor in the country. His brother Edwin, also great actor. John Wilkes Booth, basically most of his life growing up, got to ride around family property on horseback and pretend that he was a leader. He said he always had a fascination with people that had made some sort of grand mark in history, so not too surprising he would try and do the same thing, well, would do the same thing. It was around the age of 20 that John Wilkes Booth would start acting himself, becoming an actor. Apparently it wasn't very good originally. He couldn't remember his lines, but he ended up using his natural charisma and his ability to wield a sword to create something on stage his brother and father couldn't as actors. Basically a different type of actor. Here we can see that obelisk in front of us says Booth. This is the family headstone. Noticing over here in the corner on this particular one, you can't see any writing on it, but people have left coins and money. I wouldn't, but that's on them. This is actually his father's grave, the actor, Junius Brutus Booth. As you go around it, it tells the family lineage. It says died November 30th. And then over here, on this side, it says to the memory of children of Junius Brutus and Mary Ann Booth, John Wilkes, Frederick, Elizabeth, Mary Ann, Henry Byron, Joseph. Huh. I'm just noticing that his brother Edwin is not on there. He must have disassociated himself from the family. Very possible. I know he definitely disassociated himself from John Wilkes Booth after this. He wrote their sister Elizabeth a letter and said, "I have no brother." He's no brother of mine. So the story was that John Wilkes Booth, big time anti-abolitionist, he believed in slavery. He actually thought it was a gift to the slaves because he thought it brought them Christianity, it brought them to civilization, and that they should look at that as a gift. And he didn't like anybody that was trying to destroy the South that he knew. He looked at it as John Brown, and he said he saw that they were just trying to tear apart everything that the South meant to him. And so he developed an intense hatred for Abraham Lincoln, and Booth basically decided that he, over time, had kept this manifesto of his beliefs and his writings, and even when Abraham Lincoln was elected, he was telling the family members how much he was against it. But he decided he was gonna, at some point, as this went on, as he saw that it didn't seem that there was any end in sight, people dying and life changing, he started to get angry and decided he was gonna kidnap Lincoln. And then the Emancipation Proclamation really sent him over the edge, because that was basically the nail in the coffin that things were changing. So Booth was really disillusioned by this point. He pretty much didn't even care about acting anymore. He was so wrapped up in the state of the world, and like I said, he had always admired people that had made these grand influences in history. And so he went to pick up his mail at Ford Theater one day, and that's where everything changed. As he went to Ford's Theater to pick up his mail, which is where he was having his mail delivered because he had been in a show 2 months before, he found out that Abraham Lincoln was coming to the show that night, and he decided that he was going to put a plan into action to kill Abraham Lincoln. The war had just ended, Robert E. Lee had just surrendered. Booth had been walking around DC, and he had been seeing happy Union soldiers, and it just infuriated him, and he saw this as his moment to make his mark in history, and he did. Parents' graves right there. So what he decided to do was he had a meeting with a couple of his childhood friends and some other people that he had massed to originally help take part in the kidnapping, because at the time it wasn't unthinkable to possibly kidnap Lincoln. He didn't have Secret Service. He really didn't travel with a guard that often. He would frequently travel alone. And so he had somebody that knew the back roads. He had someone who was a former thug. He had, you know, about basically 8 people that were conspirators. They even included the woman that owned the boarding house because she knew about it. So he went and met with them and told them that he wanted to put this plan into action that day, and that he himself was going to kill Lincoln that night. He wanted one man to go to the Secretary of State's house to kill him. He wanted one person to go to Vice President Andrew Johnson's house, kill him. And so the plan was set in motion. Booth went back to Ford's Theater, went up into where the booth was, and carved out a little notch inside the first doorway and made it so that he would be able to put a stick there to bar the door once he got in. And then his plan was to shoot Abraham Lincoln. He had a Derringer. He had made sure that it was clear, that it wasn't going to jam. He had made sure his horse was in good condition. And then his plan was to wait until the biggest laugh of the night, around 10 p.m., the show starting at 8. He would show up, and he would make his way up into where President Lincoln was sitting with his guests, and he was going to assassinate Lincoln. The theater owner knew Booth, and like I said, he had worked there a couple of months before in a show, performed there many times on that stage, and even got his mail there, so they had nothing to suspect. And 8 o'clock, the owner of Ford's Theater had actually put an ad in the Gazette saying that President Lincoln would be the guest there that night along with General Grant. Now at 8 o'clock when the show started, there was no Lincoln. But then eventually a carriage pulled up out front with Abraham and Mary Todd and their guests, and they made their way up into the balcony of the Ford's Theater. Now, Booth showed up around 9 o'clock, an hour later, secured his horse in the alley, went underneath the stage, out another door, and over into the Star Bar next door and started to drink, buying people shots apparently, and then made his way over, back again, came right in the front doors, made his way up the stairs, made his way around the back of the crowd, and then as he made it over to the doorway, there actually was apparently a guard there. It was his first day, and John Wilkes Booth pulled out a calling card that apparently in those days would have gotten John Wilkes Booth, because of who he was, access to anywhere in DC, and he was given access through the doorway. John Wilkes Booth went through the door, looking through a little hole in the door, like a peephole, to see where Lincoln was, barred the door as he planned, then went through the next door, pulling out his Derringer and shooting President Lincoln right behind the ear. John Wilkes Booth then pulled out a knife and slashed at Mr. Rathbun, who was the guest of President Lincoln, Mary Todd, and then threw his legs over the balcony, getting his spurs caught on the portrait of George Washington and the American flag bunting that was there. And as he tried to jump from the balcony to the stage, he landed awkwardly and ended up breaking his ankle. He shouted something about the tyrants and then bolted off the stage. I say something because there's 2 or 3 different things that people have claimed he said. Nobody has said the same thing, or I mean, nobody has agreed that there was one thing that he said. So he got on his horse and took off, and of course then basically was trying to make his way south. He felt like if he could get south, he had a better chance of surviving. More people would help him, and that's exactly what he did. A manhunt, the largest manhunt in history, started. They offered a $100,000 reward, and while Abraham Lincoln was being attended to and taken across the street where he would die in the Peterson boarding house, John Wilkes Booth would set out hiding. First he would find a doctor at the doctor's farm who would help set his ankle and let him rest for a little while until he found out who he was and what he did, and then ask Booth and his accomplice to leave. And they did. They made their way over to a river where someone helped them get into a boat, gave them a compass, and told them to go to Virginia. Well, they rode all night and accidentally went west to Maryland. And so this continued on. They continued trying to evade police, and then eventually found their way to a barn where they were surrounded, and the barn was burned down with Booth in it, and then they were able to get John Wilkes Booth out. There was a story that he escaped and went on to live his days out in Oklahoma, and I even did a video about how there was like a mummy that they used to cart around at all these circuses and sideshows and things that kind of look like a wax figure. Some of you people even thought it was, but they would claim at this time that that was John Wilkes Booth. But they ended up burying John Wilkes Booth originally in an unmarked grave in a prison cemetery, and then eventually were able to, I guess the family was able to move his body here. Now here's justice for you. Out of all the people involved in this, everyone that was named as a conspirator, some were put to death or put in prison for life, and Booth is the only one that got no real punishment other than his death, which I don't think he necessarily would have fought. I mean, like I said, he always admired the hero of a story, and in his mind, even as he was on the lam hiding out, he would keep a diary still professing that he did the right thing, and that if he was wrong, then God would tell him so. And he stuck with that all the way to the end. He sometimes was written in history as a failed actor. He was actually a very successful actor in his day who just didn't like the change that he saw coming in America, and when the war was over, he basically snapped. Now, if you're fascinated like I am with this section of American history, there's a lot of things that you can go visit pertaining to it. Starting at Ford's Theater, where they have the Derringer on display that John Wilkes Booth ended up shooting Lincoln with. They also have the boot that was cut off of him with the broken ankle. You can go to the Henry Ford Museum in, I believe it's just outside of Detroit, and they have the actual chair that Lincoln was sitting in. And then you can go where we're gonna go next. We're gonna go to the Museum of Health and Science. And it's just west of here in Maryland, about 30 minutes north of DC. And they are the ones that have the actual bullet and some of the bone fragments of Lincoln's from the autopsy. Still unmarked. Crazy story. Can't even imagine living through that time in history, what that must have been like. To me, it's kind of sick that people leave a $5 bill and pennies here. Personally, I wouldn't leave them a thing, and I'm not gonna leave them a thing. Well, we've made it over to the National Museum of Health and Medicine. Hope we'll have better luck this time than the last time I was here. Nope, we are in luck today. One of the most famous things that they have here, and what we wanted to come see, was the bullet that changed history. John Wilkes Booth's Derringer bullet that took Lincoln's life is actually here on display in that little case. It's getting a bit of a reflection on it, but you can see it right there. Isn't that something? Dr. Edward Curtis dislodged this bullet from President Lincoln's brain during autopsy. Shot right above the neck, behind the ear, kind of where the neck and head meet. Said after President Lincoln died, his body was transported to the White House, where a post-mortem investigation took place. Surgeon General Joseph Barnes and Robert Stone presided, while assistant surgeons Woodward and Curtis of the Army Medical Museum performed the autopsy. And they said their report said, "A little black mass no bigger than the end of my finger, dull, motionless, and harmless, yet the cause of such mighty changes in the world's history as we may perhaps never realize." Here's a side view. I'm trying to give you every angle that they make available here in the glass case. These are bone fragments inside this case from President Lincoln's skull taken during his autopsy. And then this is another piece of bone fragment. It says found in Dr. Edwards' autopsy kit. How does that just accidentally end up in there? And then these are the sleeves, the sleeve cuffs that Dr. Curtis wore during the autopsy, and they're stained with President Lincoln's blood. It says when they arrived, they assessed the president with searching the wound with their fingers and agreed that the president's death was imminent. President condition around 2 a.m. was getting worse. They attempted to locate the bullet with Nielaton's probe. After unsuccessfully probing the wound site, nothing further was done. Lincoln died at 7:22 a.m. And that rod is the Nielaton's probe that was mentioned, that they searched for the bullet. This was the book that they read the last rites to Lincoln out of. And that ditch has some of Abraham Lincoln's hair. Sad day in American history, done by one man, John Wilkes Booth. All right, my friends, I hate to say I'm happy to see the bullet, but I am happy to see it because I came here before, didn't get to see it, and now it's back on display. The reason I couldn't see it was because they told me they were having problems with the case. security at the time that the bullet was in, so glad to see they got that fixed. Thank you all for watching. Have a great night. We'll see you next time.